Hello, everyone. Welcome to our last class of the series of 4 classes about Jewish Apocrypha. I'm very happy to see you all today, and thank you so much for coming. And thank you for all your interest in these classes. I have a lot of fun, I need to tell you. And today I have a very ambitious goal of covering 3 books in one class. So that's why we're going to start right away, and it will be a speed run through books. Are you ready? Okay. Very well. So the first book that I would like to, we talked about the Book of Jubilees, and we talked about the Book of Enoch first, and the general history of Apocrypha. And today I want to study Book of Judith. This is going to be our next book, and I will share a screen and start the presentation, but we will look at it like briefly. We're not going to go into too many details, but I really want you to show this book. It's a very interesting book, and like many other books, I have to say, but it's also very unique in many different respects. So, okay, Book of Judas, can you see it? All right, so the Book of Judas is roughly 100 BCE. It's an ancient Hebrew non-historical book, a parable, a theological novel, or maybe it's even was one of the first historical novels, and we'll see why. It's a story about a pious Jewish widow whose name is Judith, and in Hebrew her name is Yehudit, which is a symbolic name. That's why it's one of the reasons why this book is actually more of a parable or a novel, because she's not any historic character. She's clearly a fictional character, and her name means like Jewess, a Jewish woman. And she is extremely beautiful and wise and charming and just a very, very interesting woman, I have to tell you. And she, using her wisdom and beauty and charm, she destroys or assassinates an Assyrian general, Holofernes, and this way she saves Israel, because Israel was going to be invaded and she prevented this invasion. And we don't know if the Book of Judas was originally written in Hebrew or in Greek. As I mentioned before, these types of books, our Apocrypha books, they're not a part of our Jewish canon, meaning that they're not seen as sacred books in our tradition, but they are part of the Christian canon and seen as sacred books for them. But as you see, it's 100 BC, so it's way before Christianity. It has nothing to do with Christianity. It's a Jewish book written by Jews, but we don't know which language it was written. Might be Hebrew or Greek. We obviously only have a Greek version, and it contains a lot of historical references. But as I said, it's not a historical book because a lot of like the background, the details are inaccurate. And this is just a part of the story. It's meant to be this way. It's not by mistake. It's just because it's meant to be a fictional book in a way. And the way it describes like political institutions and some terminology, especially military terminology and geography and all of that, it points to Hasmonean period. And Judas might be a character parallel to Judah, the Maccabee. And that is the reason why I want to study this book today, because we are approaching the season of Hanukkah. So let's go back quickly to see our chart, to see when it was written. So we talked about the Book of Enoch, which is an early book in the Greek rule, and we talked about the Book of Jubilees, which is roughly at the same time as Book of Maccabees. So Judas is before that, but it is in Hasmonean rule. And as I said, her name, Judas, or Yehudit, suggests that she might be a parallel character to Yehuda, the Maccabee, and her victory over Holofernes is a victory of Jews over evil Greek rulers. So it's a very metaphorical book. It's very, very interesting. And we can also see that Book of Judas is the canonical book in Catholic Church, in Orthodox, like Eastern Orthodox, and in Ethiopian, here everywhere, and of course not in Protestant and not in Jewish Tanakh. So, do you have any questions at this point? So let's look what the Book of Judas is about. So here is a picture that I chose, and this is a picture that is a painting that was drawn by Gustav Klimt, which portrays Judas with the head of Holofernes, whom she killed. And I chose this painting. There are a lot of paintings of her. She was like a very popular model, a motif for painters and throughout the history. And this is relatively new, obviously. It's like modern art. And the reason why I chose her is because the model for this portrait, Adele Bloch-Bauer, she was Jewish, and Klimt painted her. So this is like a most historically accurate depiction of Judas in my understanding. So it says Judas and Holofernes, and we see this beautiful woman, very charming, and she has a head of a dead body. So I'm sure that you are familiar with this story to a certain extent. It's a very famous story, and it talks about this woman who is very righteous. She is a widow. She doesn't have children. She's rich. She's educated. She's very wise, and she's very much respected by her community. Everyone likes her and respects her, and she's just a very positive character. So she lived in a city that is going to be attacked. And everything, by the way, it happens outside of the land of Israel, kind of on the border of the land of Israel, and going to be attacked from Babylon, from the north. And this kind of a city where she lives, it's like on the border. And if the city is going to be, captured and defeated, then the troops, the army of enemies, will enter Israel and destroy it. So she's in the city, and people in the city, they kind of get very depressed about what's going on. So they are afraid that they're going to be killed, and they don't really want to surrender, but they also rely on God, and they say, we'll have 5 days, and after that we will surrender, but we'll wait for 5 days and see what's going to happen. So Judas comes, and she says, do not despair. We need to believe in God and trust God, and we're going to win. So she supports everyone emotionally, and she shows her bravery. And I chose just like a couple of examples from the text, just to give you like the taste, the flavor of the text, that you kind of can have a little bit of understanding what this text looks like. But I encourage you to read it if you're interested in your own free time, because it's a story that is very easy to read. It doesn't have any mystical angels, demons stuff that we discussed in the previous books. It's more of a novel about this very interesting, victorious woman and the Jewish people. So here are some examples that we can read from this book. This is the part of the speech of Judith to show that she is very, very pious. This is chapter 8, and she says, and now who are you that have tempted God this day and stand instead of God among the children of men? She's talking to people who are ready to give up. And now try the Lord Almighty, but you shall never know anything. For you cannot find the depths of the heart of man, neither can you perceive the work of human mind. Then how can you search out God, who made all these things, and know his mind, or comprehend his purpose? No, my brothers, provoke not the Lord our God to anger. So this is the very typical theology of the Book of Judas, because she's talking that, we cannot really understand mind of God, because we don't even understand mind of people. So how can we do that? And she says that we should not provoke the anger of God, but we rather should trust God. So this theology is very, very pious, and it's very much loving to God and very much like trusting God in all of the aspects. And she will need it because she is going to embark on a very dangerous adventure. She is going to, what she actually did, and that she left the city and she went to the camp of the enemies where Holofernes was. And she came there and she said, you know, I realized that, you know, my city is going to be destroyed, and, you know, I came to you. I want to be, you know, with you and accept the King Nebuchadnezzar and his rule. So she's pretending to be a traitor. And, you know, she speaks to Holofernes, and she's very beautiful and very charming, and he likes her very much. And this is from the chapter 11. Then the words pleased Holofernes and all his servants, and they marveled at her wisdom and said, there is no such a woman from one end to the earth to the other, both for beauty of face and wisdom of words. So it kind of underlined many times that she was not only beautiful, but she was also very wise. So they're all charmed. They're all charmed. She's like this, has this charisma, and she also shows her piety in a way that she says, you know, I need to pray. I'm still Jewish woman, and I need to go to pray, like in the outside of the camp, and she would do that several times. She refuses to eat their food because she keeps kosher. That's very clear in the book. So she observes all of the laws of Jews and Judaism, but she pretends to be this traitor. And her plan works out fine. She kind of got Holofernes drunk. He wanted to seduce her because they say, you know, she's such a beautiful woman, we cannot let her go. And they like drink together in the tent, and then he fall asleep, and then she does what she does. In chapter 13, then she came to the pillar of the bed, which was that Holofernes had, and took down his sword and approached to his bed and took hold of the hair of his head and said, strengthen me, O Lord God of Israel, this day. And she smote twice upon his neck with all her might, and she took away his head from him. Very brutal scene. She cuts off his head, chops it off, and takes a hand and goes back to her city. And when people see her with the head of Holofernes, they all rejoice and they gain back their spirit, and they eventually will win because they believe that God is with them. So this is, in a nutshell, this is the story. For mysterious reasons, this story is not a part of our canon. Can you suggest maybe why? It's an interesting story. It's very captivating. It's about a brave, this kind of a woman who is actually pretty scary and ruthless, but she gains victory for the whole Israel. She's very, very praised. And when she comes back, everyone loves her even more. She never, by the way, got married again, though it's sad that many people wanted to marry her, but she retained her faithfulness to her late husband, and she lived till like more than 100 years old, and, you know, lived in her city. So if you have any ideas why this book is not in the canon, not in our Tanakh? And does this book maybe remind you of something? Some other book, maybe, or two? Don't be shy.
Yeah, Carney. It reminds me Yael and Sisra.
Yes, absolutely. Very good. So the Yael and Sisra, the book is telling, the story is telling us that she also kind of pretended to be a traitor, and she kills Sisra. The difference between these books, that in Yael, she took not the sword, but she killed him with like a hammer and a spike. So she did not use the male weapons. Here, like, Judas is much more straightforward. She like takes a sword and she chops off. Very good. Very similar. The other book that it might remind us of is Book of Esther. again, of being this very beautiful, charming woman, femme fatale, and who doesn't kill anyone, but also using her wisdom and deception and like intrigues, she also gains victory for Jews, right? So that might be one of the reasons why this book didn't make it into the canon, because maybe it was too similar to other stories and felt redundant or not authentic. The other reason might be, of course, is that, you know, it's too feministic. Like, there's this woman, again, that is using male weapon, and she is like so brave. But on the other hand, the Jews wrote this book, so I don't think that that might have been a reason. If they were able to produce this book, why wouldn't they like that being? The other reason, of course, might be that it's a late book. As usual, that's always a problem because it's in Hasmonean rule, meaning that it was after the victory of Hasmoneans over Greeks. There is one other reason, which is quite strange, and it might seem like a little kind of not very important detail, but it actually might be the real reason why it didn't get into the canon. In this book, it also talks about one of the characters whom I didn't mention yet, who is, he comes with Holofernes, but then he converts to Judaism. And it's said that when he converted to Judaism, he got circumcised, but it doesn't say that he went into mikveh. His name is Achior, and it might have been a problem for rabbis because in our rabbinical law, a person who converts to Judaism must go both to the mikveh and make a circumcision. Of course, if it's a woman, it's just the mikveh. So because it didn't mention the mikveh, possibly rabbis saw that as a mistake, and that's why they didn't approve the book. So that might have been another reason. So it's very interesting, again, question of how some books make into canon, some not, and why. So this is an example of a very interesting book that was very popular, as I said, in arts and in just influenced a lot of literature and culture and all of that. It's a Jewish book produced by Jews, written by Jews for Jews, but we kind of lost it along the way for reasons that we will never know for sure. So that is like really quick overview of Book of Judas. And as I said, the reason why I brought it to you, not only because I kind of like Judas as a character, though she's very cool, but because it is connected to Hasmoneans and to Judah the Maccabee and to Hanukkah. And because we're getting to Hanukkah, now we're going to look to two more books, which are the books of Maccabees. So, have any one of you ever read books of Maccabees? There are 4 of them, I can tell you. We're going to look only at two first books. So, if you haven't read the books of Maccabees, how do you know the history of Hanukkah? How do you know what happened at Hanukkah? What are we celebrating very soon, in a few days? How do we know that? What's the whole story about? Where is the source of the story? So we have books for Purim, we have Book of Esther, for example, that tell us the story, but where are the books about Hanukkah? Good question. So it's a very interesting phenomenon because we do have story of Hanukkah. It is in the Book of Maccabees, but Book of Maccabees are not part of our canon. They're part of Christian canon, again, not a part of Tanakh. But we do still celebrate Hanukkah. So how did this happen that the source of the holiday of Hanukkah, which we celebrate, is not considered a sacred text for us? Isn't that an interesting question? Well, at least it was an interesting question for me. And that's why I wanted to bring you this book specifically before Hanukkah, because now we can look at the history and see what happened there. So let's look. As I said, there are 4 books of Maccabees. We're going to look at the first Maccabees and second Maccabees. The third Maccabees is kind of not connected to Hanukkah that much. It talks about the other part of like Hasmonean history. The fourth one also is very, very late, and it's not even part of any canon, and it's talks about other subjects as well. It's like doesn't touch the history of Hanukkah. So we're going to look at the books which explicitly tell us the history of Hanukkah and what are we celebrating. So let's look. Very exciting. So Maccabees, first book of Maccabees. Let's start with that. So first book of Maccabees, it's around 150 BCE. So it's not, it's around the same time as Book of Judas was written. And that's another reason why these books are connected. And the Book of Judas is perhaps a metaphorical kind of a book that's describing sort of the same events. And it's unlike Book of Judas, it is a historical narrative. It is very, very historical. It's like a book of history. And it's describing the rise of the Hasmonean dynasty and the events of Hanukkah, obviously. And we don't know who wrote this book, but he's such a fan of Hasmonean family that clearly he was a supporter, maybe a member of a family, who knows. And the purpose of the book that he wrote is actually to justify the position at the head of the Judean state, of Maccabees' position of the head of Judean state. Because I don't know if you know about that, but it's a little bit problematic because Hasmoneans, they are not part of the Davidic dynasty. They're part of priestly clan. So it's a little bit problematic that they actually became kings of ancient Israel, Judea, because they were not really supposed to. So it's a whole book that actually explaining why they were supposed to. And probably the book was written in Jerusalem, and the original Hebrew is lost, but we are certain that it was written in Hebrew. The version that we have is in Greek, and it's a part of Septuagint. Septuagint is a very interesting collection because Septuagint became kind of the base for Christian Bible. But Septuagint, again, it's not a Christian text. It's a Jewish work produced by Jews for Jews. It's just a translation of Tanakh into Hebrew, well, into Greek. And the original Hebrew was lost, but the Greek translation remained in Septuagint. And the book is held as canonical scripture by the Catholic, Orthodox, and Oriental Orthodox churches, except for the Orthodox churches of Ethiopia and Eritrea, which is quite interesting because there are other books that are canonical in their churches, like we spoke about Book of Jubilees and Book of Enoch, but Book of Maccabees is not suddenly. And as it says here, the book is ignored by the rabbis of antiquity completely. It's also a very interesting subject for a discussion of how we know the story and where the story comes from and what rabbis say about the story. So rabbis, meaning the rabbis of antiquity in the beginning of the Common Era, 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th century, this kind of rabbis, they actually were not huge fans of Hasmoneans, and they don't explain this events of Hanukkah the way they are explained in the Book of Maccabees. As we know, they are connecting the story of Hanukkah to the miracle of the oil, and that's why we light the candles, right? Because there was oil in the temple that was attacked, and then it's continued to burn for 8 days when the rite of purification of the temple was accomplished. So this is the whole story. We know that from the rabbis. This is not a story in the Book of Maccabees. And on the other hand, like rabbis do not mention the story of the Book of. So they clearly knew about the story because that was written for quite a long time before the rabbis, but they didn't like it and they didn't use it. And we'll maybe see why potentially they didn't like it. So let's look at some examples from this book. So what I need to tell you right away is that most of this book is a history. It's like describing the history of Hasmonean dynasty. Most of it. It's just a little part of it is describing the story of Hanukkah. The rest of it, I would say like 80% probably of the book is describing all kinds of military activities, fights, battles and things like that, and the succession of dynasty and who is becoming the ruler and all of that. We're going to focus more on the history of Hanukkah. And it's not, I can tell you that as a historic part of the book, it's not very exciting to read. It's interesting maybe for history, but like as a narrative, it's not super exciting because it's a lot of history. So there are few key features which I kind of summarize because it's a pretty long book and we will not have time to read through the entire book. So as I said, number one is that it's a history of Hasmonean dynasty. This is the main purpose of the book. And this is what the book is about, really. A description of military campaigns, a big part of the book. Then there is a very strong idea that the foreign rulers, that's a mistake, rulers are terrible, meaning foreign kings at Israel. They're absolutely terrible, evil. They want to destroy Israel. They are idolaters. Today, somehow English is very difficult for me. I don't know why, but very negative. And that the neighbors of Judeans, I mean, the people who live in the same area, they're all enemies and they all want to destroy Israel. So very, very strong motive in this book that everyone is our enemy and they want to kill us, which is not inaccurate at that time, obviously, because there was an invasion and there were tensions and there were real conflicts and war. But it's a very prominent idea of the book, unlike the second book of Maccabees, for example. What's important is that there is also a very strong idea that God's providence will not solve anything. People in the book of Maccabees, they don't really rely on God, I can tell you. More than that, that God is not even actually mentioned in this book by the word. Like, it doesn't say God did something or God helped us. It doesn't mention any miracles, not a miracle of oil or any other miracles or divine intervention or anything like that. All the victories of this book are results of the actions of the people. There is nothing there. They do mention like heavens sometimes and the help of heavens. It's not like it's completely deprived of any kind of sacred ideas, but it doesn't have God as an actor in this book and doesn't mention God as a word. And of course, it talks about the history of Hanukkah and it gives us the date, the 22th of Kislev. Well, we know when the Hanukkah is celebrated. So these are the main kind of ideas of the book of Maccabees. So let's look at some of the examples from the text. This is the first chapter, the beginning of the book, and it gives us the history of what was going on. And I'm sure that you are all familiar with this. I'm absolutely sure that you all know this type of stories. At the time, there appeared in the land of Israel a group of traitorous Jews who had no regard for the law and who had a bad influence on many of our people. They said, let's come to terms with the Gentiles, for our refusal to associate with them has brought us nothing but trouble. This proposal appealed to many people, and some of them became so enthusiastic about it that they went to the king and received from him permission to follow Gentile customs. They built in Jerusalem a stadium like those in Greek cities. They had surgery performed to hide their circumcision, abandoned the Holy Covenant, started associating with Gentiles, and did all sorts of other evil things. So I don't know about you, but like this is like kind of the story that I grew up with, that there was this like Jews who wanted to live a Greek lifestyle and that they made a reverse circumcision operations on them, surgeries, because they didn't want to appear as Jews, and nudity and beauty of the body was very important apparently for Hellenistic cultures. So, and the main, again, actors here are not actually even Greeks, but these traitorous Jews who abandoned the law. And these Jews, they brought all of the problems. So from this perspective, well, we can say that the Hasmoneans in this book, they're like this very traditionalist kind of religious folks who want to restore the tradition. And they're not actually being so kind in this. Like it mentions that, for example, when they liberate some parts of Judea from Hellenistic influence, they forcibly circumcise boys who were not circumcised, for example. this is one of the acts that they did. So they were like really zealous, and hard to say if I would like them today or not. And the same chapter, like I skipped a lot of it, but it continues. On the 15th day of the month of Kislev in the year 145, King Antiochus set up the awful horror on the altar of the temple, and pagan altars were built in the towns throughout Judea. Pagan sacrifices were offered in front of the houses and in the streets, and any books of the law which were found were torn up and burned, and anyone who was caught with a copy of the sacred book or who obeyed the laws was put to death by order of the king. Month after month, these wicked people used their power against the Israelites caught in the towns. So this is again the story that I grew up with, that there was this mad king Antiochus and that he persecuted Jews and that he forbade us from studying Torah. And this is why we spin dreidel, because dreidel was a way of kind of studying either Hebrew alphabet for children or like even some of the law. So because everything was forbidden. So this is exactly the story that is set in the Book of Maccabees. So we clearly see that this is the story that was transmitted to us and became a part of our culture, and became a tradition that explains the history of Hanukkah. So, but there is a but, because if that was the case, and that was like universally accepted, and that was the story of the Hanukkah, then there would be a canonical book as well, but it's not. So let's see what are potential problems in this book. But before I do that, can you tell me if you're familiar with this story or not? Have you heard this kind of an explanation about the story of Hanukkah? That there were like evil Greeks, they oppressed us, that they prohibited the studies of Torah, and that there was this evil Jews who wanted to have a Greek lifestyle. So you're familiar with that. We know this. Okay, very good. So let's look at other examples from the book. So this is a very important kind of an idea. As I said, that God is not really main character of the book, or not character at all. And this book actually, interestingly enough, it shows people who were very devoted to the Jewish law as being weak. And I will read you an example, you understand why. So when this persecution started, there were many people in Israel who firmly resisted the king's decree and refused to eat food that was ritually unclean. So they kept kosher. They preferred to die rather than break the Holy Covenant and eat unclean food. And many did die. Very great wrath came upon Israel. So there are many examples like that in the book, but basically it's saying that those people who wanted to keep kosher, they were kind of weak. They relied on God, and that's why they got killed. Chapter 2 have a similar kind of example. There was like another city that was besieged, and the enemies, they said there's some time, they shouted out to Jews, come out and obey the king's command, and we will spare your lives. We will not come out, they answered, meaning the Jews. We will not obey the king's command, and we will not profane the Sabbath. So this siege happened on Shabbat. The Jews, they said, we're not going to profane Shabbat, we'd rather die. So the enemy attacked them on Shabbat and killed them, their men, their wives, their children, and their livestock. Thousands of people died. And then in contrast to that, immediately when Matityahu and his friends heard the news about this, they were greatly saddened and said to one another, if all of us do as these other Jews have done and refuse to fight the Gentiles to defend our lives and our religion, we will soon be wiped off the face of the earth. On that day, they decided that if anyone attacked them on Shabbat, they would defend themselves so they would not all die as other Jews had died in their caves. So I kind of told you already that this is a historical narrative, that this book is telling the history primarily. And it's not that much of a religious text, really, because it portrays this kind of devoted Jews, as weak, as people who are being killed for no reason. And they say we'd rather desecrate Shabbat than we die. And it's a great question whether that's a valid argument or not. Would you desecrate Shabbat or die? That's a big philosophic question. And I'm sure that many of us would prefer to live rather than, choose life and death. You probably choose life. But what's important is that it portrays these people in a certain light. It also portrays priests as kind of being naive. It doesn't have a lot of respect for this kind of piety. Unlike, for example, Book of Judas, which is all about piety. This one is more about the human strength and power and bravery and military victories. And that is, by the way, the reason why the book of this story of Maccabees actually became an important and inspirational story for Zionism, because we know that people who founded Israel and who came to Israel after Holocaust, they did not rely on God that much. They were pretty secular. And the reason why they did not rely on God is it's very hard to rely on God after Holocaust. So they relied much more on themselves. They didn't wait for Messiah to come, and relied on, bravery and selflessness and all of those qualities of human beings rather than religious piety or theology or anything like that. So this story became popular in Israel due to Zionism and the history of modern Israel, obviously. But that is exactly the reason why it did not become popular among rabbis who did not include it in the canon, because it's very much against the theology and the ideas of the rabbis, for whom martyrdom and this kind of death in the sanctification of God's name is not, well, it's a bad thing, but it's not a sign of weakness the way it is in the Book of Maccabees. So that's problem number one that we have with this text. Let's see what it says specifically about the Hanukkah and what happened there. As I said, it's not going to talk about the miracle of oil or anything like that. It says, on 25th day of the 9th month, the month of Kislev, which is when we celebrate Hanukkah, in the year 148, was the anniversary of the day that the Gentiles had desecrated the altar. They're saying that the events of Hanukkah happened on the same day when the altar in the temple was desecrated. And we know that it was desecrated, it was destroyed, they brought unkosher sacrifices under to defile the temple and the altar. So they say it happened, Hanukkah and rededication of the temple happened at the same time, another year. And the new altar was dedicated, and hymns were sung to the accompaniment of harps, lutes, and cymbals. All the people bowed down with their faces to the ground and worshipped and praised the Lord for giving them victory. For 8 days, they celebrated the rededication of the altar with great joy. They brought burnt offerings and offered fellowship offerings and thank offering. They decorated the front of the temple with gold crowns and shields, rebuilt the gates and the priest's room and put doors on them, because all of that was destroyed before. Now that the Jews had removed the shame which the Gentiles had brought, they held a great celebration. Then Judas, his brother, and the entire community of Israel decreed that the rededication of the altar should be celebrated with a festival of joy and gladness at the same time each year, beginning on the 25th of the month of Kislev and lasting for 8 days. This is the description of Hanukkah. As I said, it doesn't say anything about the miracles, no oil, nothing. It's just a victory, purification of the temple, rededication of the temple, and that's why we celebrated 8 days. So it's interesting, I think, because part of the story we clearly know, because they're clearly part of our tradition, but it's not the whole story. But some aspects here are completely missing. So where did these aspects came from? So interesting question. So what do you think? Do you think anything? Any thoughts, feelings, questions? Margot, I see you want to say something.
Yeah. I would guess that the rabbis put that in to make it from a festival that celebrated a military victory to a more theological and miraculous event, and to put God back into the narrative.
I agree. I think that is exactly what happened. Yeah.
And do you know whether the 25th of December was chosen by the Christians for the birth of Jesus in order to supersede or incorporate what was obviously a traditional Jewish festival at that time of the year? Because the Christian church often did incorporate other people's festivals into theirs.
So that's yeah. That's a very
the people who look at the astrological signs and so on say that Jesus was probably born in July.
That's a very good question. We don't know. Yeah, we don't know why Christians chose this day. It's also not very clear why we chose this day. Like, you know, it says that it's the 25th of Kislev, but why is this day? So the number one theory, general theory, is that a lot of cultures had holidays on this time of the year. And why did they have the holidays? Because it is the darkest time of the year, and all cultures have this kind of a holidays of light or something that is connected to light. So that's why Christmas, there are lights everywhere and decorations. Like decorating a tree has nothing really to do with Jesus, but it has to do something with light. We also have our candles, and it's also light. At the same time, in Roman Empire, they had their holidays, which happened exactly at the same week also, like Saturnalia. I don't know what's the English for that, but that should be something like that. So possible that Christians took the Roman holiday instead, because there's so many holidays that happen at that time, and not outside of this culture. Many different countries that are very remote from the land of Israel. This is the time of the year. So to prove kind of my point, since you asked this question, I'll read to you quickly a portion from the Talmud, which has nothing to do with the Book of Maccabees, but I have it ready, so I'll read it for you just as an alternative story, which might explain why this time of the year was important. Let me just open it. And this is the tractate Avodah Zarah in Talmud, which tells us the story about the Adam Harishon, first human being on earth. The sages thought when Adam Harishon saw that the day was progressively diminishing, as the days became shorter from the autumnal equinox until the winter solstice, he did not yet know that it's a normal phenomenon, and therefore he said, "Woe is me, perhaps because I sinned, the world is becoming dark around me and will ultimately return to the primordial state of chaos and disorder. And this is the death that was sentenced upon me from heaven." He arose and spent 8 days in fasting and prayer. Once he saw that the season of Tevet, the winter season, had arrived, and saw that the days was progressively lengthened, he said, "Clearly the days become shorter and then longer, and this is the order of the world." He went and observed the festival of 8 days. Upon the next year, he observed both these 8 days on which he had fasted of the previous year, and these 8 days of the celebration as the days of festivities. And he, Adam, established this festival for the sake of heaven, but they, the Gentiles of later generation, established them for the sake of idol worship. So this is relatively late, because Talmud, we know, at least 5th century CE, maybe later than that. So it's from the Book of Maccabees, that's like more than 600 years, right? So it's a long time past. But the explanation that is given here by the rabbis is that the 8-day festival is connected to the fact that the days are becoming shorter. And the first human being was scared of that, because he thought like, okay, one day the sun is not going to come up at all and there will be perpetual night. But then the sun came back, and then he realized that this is the way of the world, and that's why he celebrated first Hanukkah for 8 days. So this is an alternative version for you. But as it says here, and then pagans, they like took it from us and they used it for idol worship, which is possibly that happened, but also it's possible that it's just such a natural kind of a holiday that is connected to this, the state of nature, that many cultures came up with the same thing. So let's look now at the second book of Maccabees, because it is going to give us a different version of the story. The second book of Maccabees is not a continuation of the first book of Maccabees. It's an alternative version of the same events. So let's look really quickly at that. So second book of Maccabees, around the same time it is written. It's not a sequel, as I said, independent tradition of the same events. The author is unknown, but he says in the introduction to this book that he is rewriting the 5-volume work that already existed, and he just wrote a shorter version of that. We don't have that 5-volume work, but it says the name of the author of that 5 volumes, Jason of Cyrene. I practiced how to say this city, and I forgot completely. So if I mispronounce it, forgive me. And Daniel, please edit this part and don't post it on Cyrene. But anyways, it's a city in diaspora in Northern Africa. And the author was a diaspora Jew. So both authors were probably diaspora Jew. The Jason, who wrote the 5 volumes, was a diaspora Jew, and the author who wrote the second Maccabees was a diaspora Jew. And the main topic of this book is the celebration of Hanukkah, actually, unlike the first Maccabees, which is like the history of Maccabees. What is a big part of that, in contrast to the first of Maccabees, and that it has also the stories of martyrdom, but they are very praised. The heroes of this are not seen as weak and losers, on the contrary, they're very strong. And it had influence, again, in our culture, in the martyrdom in Talmud, but the book is not really mentioned by the rabbis. And the reason for that is that because this book was written in Greek, we know that it was never written in Hebrew. Originally, it was written in Greek. It was written outside of Israel. It was written in diaspora. So it's pretty clear why it did not become a canonical book, because it was just not seen as, godly inspired writing, though it does have a lot of interesting information for us. And we don't even know if rabbis knew about it that much, because Josephus, who was a famous Jewish historian, he doesn't mention it, so maybe it wasn't that known actually to Jews, the later Jews of antiquity. And none of these books, not the first, not the second Maccabees, is in the Dead Scroll community, as we spoke about. That the Book of Jubilees was very important for them. The Book of Enoch was important. These books are not important for them at all, because again, they didn't like Hasmoneans probably. So again, very interesting book, a lot of interesting information in it. Not canonical, mainly because it was written in Hebrew and Greek, and because it was late. So let's look at some examples. There's the first chapter. In the year 169, when Demetrius II was king of Syria, he wrote to tell you about the persecution and the hard times that came upon us in the years after Jason revolted against authority in the Holy Land. And this Jason, he is a priest, actually, but he is pro-Greek priest, so he is a traitor. Then we prayed to the Lord, and he answered our prayers. So they sacrificed animals, gave offerings of grain, lit the lamps in the temple, and set out the sacred laws. And see now that you keep the festival of Booth in the month of Kislev in the year 188. So it is in a very sharp contrast with the Book of Maccabees, because in this book, God is very much present, and everything happens because of the will of God. And it's a very theological book. It has a lot of beautiful prayers. It's very poetic, and it's very much, heroes are very much relying on God, unlike the first Maccabees. What is interesting is that they're actually calling the Hanukkah the festival of Booth, which is Sukkot. So they are saying that you keep Sukkot in the month of Kislev. That's very interesting idea. Do you have a suggestion why is that might be the case? What's the connection between Sukkot and Hanukkah?
They're both 8 days.
Yep, exactly. They're both 8 days. And we also know that the dedication of the Mishkan was 8 days. And here we have a dedication and purification of the temple, which is also 8 days. So here the main explanation for the Hanukkah is actually the purification of the temple, which according to many traditions happened multiple times during Sukkot. So let's look at that. That's chapter 1 again. On the 25th day of the month of Kislev, we shall celebrate the festival of purification of the temple. We thought it's necessary to notify you in order that you also may celebrate the festival of Booth and the festival of fire given to Nehemiah, who built the temple and the altar and offered sacrifices. So there, what basically the text is saying, and again, this is a short version, but it's going to say that the first temple that was built by Solomon, it was also dedicated on Sukkot, and the second temple, when it was rebuilt, it was also dedicated on Sukkot, and that's why the dedication of the temple on Hanukkah is also 8 days, because apparently that was a good time for dedications of the temples, and these were the rituals. So they are bringing Nehemiah. Nehemiah obviously is the one who came back from the Babylonian exile and rededicated the temple. This story is not going to talk about miracles of oil. Again, it's not going to tell us the story that we all know, that the oil lasted for 8 days, but it does mention oil, which is also very interesting. At the time when our ancestors were being taken to exile in Persia, few devout priests took some fire from the altar and secretly hid it in the bottom of a dry cistern. They hid the fire so well that no one ever discovered it. Years later, when it pleased God, the Persian emperor sent Nehemiah back to Jerusalem, and Nehemiah told the descendants of those priests to find the fire. They reported to us that they had found no fire, but only some oily liquid. Nehemiah then told them to scoop some up and bring it to him. When everything for the sacrifice had been placed on the altar, he told the priests to pour the liquid over both the wood and the sacrifice. And after this was done, and some time had passed, the sun appeared from behind the clouds, and suddenly everything on the altar burst into flames. Everyone looked on in amazement. Then, while the fire was consuming the sacrifice, Jonathan, the high priest, led the people in prayer, and Nehemiah and all the people responded. So this is the parallel. Like, it doesn't talk about the miracle of oil during the Hanukkah, but it does mention some sort of miracle of oil in the previous dedication of the temple. So this is probably one of the origins of the story, but we don't know for sure. It's clearly a parallel, but it's like very interesting that it's not the same story. And I told you that the idea that God is like really saving people and helping people is very important in this book. We thank God because he saved us from great danger. We were like men ready to fight against the king, but God drove the enemy from our holy city. When King Antiochus arrived in Persia, his army seemed impossible to defeat, but they were cut to pieces in the temple of the goddess Nanea by an act of treachery on the part of their priests. King Antiochus had gone to the temple with some of his most trusted advisors so that he might marry the goddess and then take away most of the temple treasures as a wedding gift. After the priest had laid out the treasure, he and a few of his men went into the temple to collect it, but the priest closed the doors behind him, stoned him and his men from trapdoors hidden in the ceiling. Then they cut up the bodies and threw the heads to the people outside. Praise God for punishing those evil men. Praise him for everything. It's also pretty brutal, but it definitely has an idea that that was like God's will and God did it, unlike in the first Maccabees, where it's just like people. So this is the end. As I said, this is a very short and brief kind of retelling of those stories. And we have like 3 minutes to discuss of what we have learned here and why. What are all these books about? And why is it important, for example, to look the book of Maccabees in order to understand the history of Hanukkah? Maybe it's not important at all. What do you think? You have like really 3 minutes to tell me. Well, if you don't want to tell me, I'm going to tell you. So, as I said, we don't have a special book for Hanukkah. We don't read. There is no scroll. There is no scroll reading for Hanukkah. Well, yeah, we know the stories. We know the story of the crazy king Antiochus. We know the persecution of Jews. We know the rededication of temple. When we sing the song Maos Sur, for example, on Hanukkah, what is the song about? What is celebrated at Hanukkah? Carney, are you saying something?
זה חנוכת המקדש.
Yeah, exactly. This is the sanctification, purification, rededication of the temple. This is the main essence of Hanukkah. And we know that. And this is preserved in these 2 books. As I said, there are reasons why they were not included, either because they had some weird theology, not enough God's presence, too much history. It had this, it was written in the wrong language, or it was written too late, but still, it preserves our history and the development of our ideas and of our beliefs. So the reason for this all kind of course is to show that what we have in Judaism came from diverse sources that are not only Tanakh, that are not only Torah, it's not only Talmud. It came from all of those books, and even if those books are not seen as holy books in our tradition, they're still books of our history, like the history of our tradition. And the things that are mentioned in those books, they're the things that Jews used to believe and to a certain extent continue to believe. Because as I said, the story of the Greeks who wanted to, kill us and desecrated the temple, that's clearly a story that everyone believes in.
So,
yes.
so it seems to me that Hanukkah is, from what you said, is the only holiday where we in our homes feel like we're in the temple. We're rededicating, like it's really, I mean, even when you sit in a sukkah, you're doing something that's temporary, but they didn't do that in the temple.
Yeah.
But lighting the Hanukkah is, so
It is
kind of interesting.
I really hope that when you light the candles this year, this is what you're going to think about. That this is a purification of the temple, and it's our little home. So we looked at several books, and we talked about the reasoning of why they were not included. And we talked about that some of them were had some problems, like solar calendar, which was not a tradition that we followed in the Book of Jubilees, or this kind of mystical, kind of a demonic, angelic type of stories that were not probably seen as the book that should be studied by everyone, like a secret book. That's why I didn't make it to canon. This Book of Judas, for example, maybe it had a halachic problem with the circumcision, and maybe the story did not appeal to later rabbis. Maybe it was written too late. So we talked about all of this reasonings, but we know that ideas from this book, they influenced our system of belief. They influenced the system of belief of the entire Western world. And this is our responsibility. That's why congratulations. Our ancestors wrote these books, and even if we do not read them regularly. They're still our books. And I hope that you learned something new and interesting in the course of this 4 series part. I definitely learned a lot, and I'm very thankful for your participation. Now, one day we're going to do more classes. And if you have idea of what you really want to study, send me an email and tell me, because next time I would like to choose a topic that you suggest. How about that? Because this time I chose something that I really wanted to study and talk about, because that's very interesting for me. But I want you to suggest something too. And then I can make you happy with the topic that we're going to study next time. If you don't know my email by some weird chance, then ask Yarden or maybe Daniel, if you have his email, and just write to me and tell me what you would like to study, and I'll gladly appreciate that. Thank you. That is my email in the chat.
I enjoyed your presentation very much. Very good.
Thank you so much. I enjoyed spending time with you. It was obviously my first, the first session that I taught, and it will take me some more time to connect with you better. But I'm really looking forward to our next sessions in the future. I'm wishing you a wonderful week, early Shabbat Shalom, happy Hanukkah,
Yes.
and happy studies.
And happy eating.
Yeah, and a good night.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you so much.
very much. Thank you.
Bye.